Thanks, Barbara. I'm really grateful for Momentum Center having this forum. I appreciate the work they do in our community. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson and Director Proctor Gibbs for what you've shared. I really appreciate your wisdom and hope to be able to build on that with what I share this evening. I can speak to you just from my own context, which is as a white Christian cisgender straight man. And we're in a culture where all of those identities for me carry privilege. It's a privilege which on the one hand is visible all around us in places of power, but it also has this strange way too where my identities of privilege wear a kind of cloak of invisibility in our culture, which hides those identities in plain view by calling them normal or normative. And so that interplay of both the power and that subtle invisibility of privilege, I think it can bring to a forum that's called religion and racism, because Christian hegemony in our culture often tries to assert religion as being synonymous with Christianity. And so in such a culture, perhaps Christianity must be dealt with first for religion and racism, or at least white Christianity must be. And so I can speak to my own experience as a white Christian of coming to grips, of still trying to come to grips with religion and racism. I grew up in what would be considered a more progressive, liberal Christian subculture, tucked within a larger conservative Christian subculture. That's at least how I would describe my little niche in the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The CRC is a very white conservative denomination, but much of my experience was lived in a conscious contrast to that white conservatism. I was raised in one of the few racially integrated CRC churches in downtown GR. I attended one of the few racially integrated CRC Christian schools. I learned to celebrate equality and multiculturalism, and I think that much of that was framed for me in the Reformed language of grace. Grace was this way from God that we could all get along, and that's what we should focus on. That really began to unravel for me about 5 years ago, which is when I first attended a Christian institutional space that was not a white space. I attended McCormick Seminary in Chicago to do some doctoral work, and it was deeply transformative for me. There I was taught by Black professors and read non-white theologians and had a cohort of Black colleagues, which gave me the tools both to relook at my own history and to look back further into Christian history. And as I did so, what really was the key insight for me was to realize that much of the history that I had learned was actually a history of whiteness. Whiteness is that worldview which invents and elevates white people racially, culturally, and morally in order to justify dominating others. And it does so with this insidiously brilliant justification that such domination is actually a moral imperative from God. This invention of whiteness emerged and coalesced in 16th century Western Europe, as we've heard referred to, and then it was imposed in this continent in systemic and epically violent ways. Whiteness was not something I had recognized much or at all before, but once you do see whiteness, it's daunting and enraging and shaming and depressing, and possibly, by God's grace, which I still do believe in, seeing whiteness can be transformative. And it has deeply impacted my sense of personal history and of broader Christian history. In coming to see whiteness, I realized that growing up, all the integrated spaces that I was in were actually still all white spaces. In my school growing up, nearly all the teachers and leaders were white. In my mostly white church in an all-Black neighborhood, there was mostly white leadership. We talked much about equality, but not much about structural racism. We handed out food for charity, but there was no talk of community organizing or economic justice, and I certainly never heard any questions raised about the police. My church was a place of a white space of power and priorities. Seeing whiteness, I had the realization that although I went to the CRC college, it truly never occurred to me to notice or wonder why there were virtually no students of color. I never noticed hardly ever reading Black or Hispanic authors, never discussing race or racism or racial justice. Seeing whiteness, I now look back 30 years to the progressive Princeton seminary I attended and notice again, very few students of color, virtually no theologians of color to read, no mention of the racism endemic in the founders of the seminary. Seeing whiteness now, I realize I truly hadn't faced how it was that a Christian nation could be a cradle for slavery. Or if I did, I just blamed that on other bad Christians, but didn't look beyond slavery to the genocide of First Peoples, which was done with pervasive Christian theological conviction and blessing, at least white Christian conviction. Through seeing whiteness, I began to see that the country I love was also a place of lynching in white Christian communities, of systemic violence through the police carried out against Blacks and people of color throughout our country. As a country where Black World War II veterans were systematically excluded from benefits of the GI Bill, even as the prison industrial system was developed with a racist structure, all under the watch of a white Christian culture. And seeing whiteness led me to re-examine my Reformation roots too. I always drank the Kool-Aid that Reformed theology was just about correcting the Catholics, and then it turned out we had to correct a lot of other Protestants too. The goal was always to have pure, true theology. But it turns out the dawn of the Reformation was in sync with the dawn of whiteness in Western Europe, and European Christianity went out into the world carrying white supremacy with it. Well, I still believe there is a powerful theology of grace that Reformed faith can offer towards justice today. For many centuries, Reformed Christian faith perpetuated an individualistic salvation that made it possible for white Christians not only to perpetuate racism while being Christian, but as a part of Christianity itself, with a white supremacy divine mandate that manifests destiny idea at the core of faith and nation. Whiteness at the core of Western Christianity is a broken and evil reality that I believe the white church is only beginning to come to grips with. And that's perhaps even mostly true for white progressive liberal Christians like me. Those white spaces I grew up in were full of many good-hearted people, but those spaces fell short in the capacity to see how whiteness in Christianity has itself been at the core of racism and injustice. We white liberals loved Dr. King when he talked about racial reconciliation, but we tuned him out when he talked about structural justice. And we didn't listen at all to Black theologians Thurman and Cone and West, and certainly didn't listen to Malcolm X and to many other voices beyond Christianity through whom God was speaking truth to whiteness. So let me pause. That's a lot to take in, I know. It's been a lot for me. But to help find a way forward, I want to share an information graphic from my esteemed colleague, Reverend Dr. Denise Kingdom Greer. She's an African-American pastor, theologian, and leader in my community, and her website, the First Corinthians Project, offers a profound way forward for us. She speaks first of the evocative concept of rehearsing history, rehearing history through the voices of people of color, exposing whiteness till a new narrative settles in us, and then bringing that narrative into our present story through repentance, through remembering the dismembered bodies of the past and present, and reminding our thoughts and actions to steer a path towards racial justice. So as a white Christian cisgender straight man, I feel called to take a lead in this work in my own way, to lead through listening to and centering the voices of people of color, to lead through learning about whiteness and white Christian complicity, to lead through following. As with my congregation, we're seeking to partner with leaders of color for justice initiative, to lead by committing to rehearsing and repenting and reminding, because there's so much more to uncover and relearn and rebuild. I still believe that through God's grace, even though there is often shame and anger in seeing whiteness, it also is a way to justice and abundance. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to more conversation and action towards racial justice.